I saw a picture in the internet. It was a picture of Mr. Holmes, who killed all of the people in the theater, and it was written, I killed 12 people and I wounded 70 people. They called me psychopath. If I was Muslim, they would have called me terrorist. These are the things that we are facing right now. When I was in the airplane coming back from Iran, when the Oklahoma City bombing happened, and I was listening to the news in the airplane, they said this was done by pro-Iranian Muslim terrorists and the media. And a few days after, they said Timothy McVeigh. And Sara mentioned, and Father Alexei, that I heard that from CNN, MSNBC, that the guy, this Mr. Page, thought that he's attacking the Muslim group. First of all, these people are white supremacists, and they can read the Sikh temple versus the Muslim mosque, and the sign was there. If they don't know that much, I don't know how they are superior. But the question is that why, we go back to the same thing that you mentioned, why we have this much Islamophobia, particularly in the United States more than anywhere else. I think that when we talk about Michelle Bachmann, Peter King, Michelle Bachmann was a blessing to Sarah Palin. God sent her to people to appreciate Sarah Palin. But what do you think? Let's start with Father Alexei about the Islamophobia and the things that's going on there.
Well, Doctor, you raise an interesting question because, and you raised Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh was a Catholic.
I didn't want to say that.
That's all right. But we don't talk about Catholic terrorism. You see what I'm saying? This man was in the... I know the priest that tended to his family. And his family is absolutely devastated about what their son did there. But nobody goes around talking about Catholic terrorism. This man was a terrorist, period. He was an absolute nut, but he was also a terrorist. Why then is it perfectly acceptable to say and to brand everyone else as a Muslim terrorist, or Muslim terrorist activity, or any of these other expressions that you're all more familiar with than I? It's politically convenient now, I think. It's certainly not morally acceptable. I continually, when I make presentations in our Catholic institutions and other places, warn our people about painting people with a wide brush. And I always tell them, you can't say that all Protestants are the same, all Jews are the same, all Hindus are the same. Certainly all Catholics are not the same. All right? You Catholic ladies at the front, do you agree with me? Do I get an amen there? Yes, all right, good. So why is it acceptable then in our society to say that all Muslims are the same? It's not okay. And those of us who are opposed to painting people with this wide brush must be willing to take a stand and say, wait a minute. Wait a minute here, you can't do that. And to call people on it.
I want to bring in a note of optimism, which is that I'm not sure that I agree with the claim that Islamophobia is the worst in America. I think that Europe has a very significant problem with Islamophobia, and I would say that it's much worse, even than it is in the United States. And for all of the problems that we do have with Islamophobia and how much it has permeated the political rhetoric here, I do think that the integration of the Muslim community in America is a much greater success story here than it has been overseas. And the other point of optimism that I'll bring in is that it's disheartening to see where the rhetoric is right now. But the truth is that a lot of other communities have experienced this same level of open hatred in the past in the United States, and it has slowly transformed. This was true of the Jewish community. And eventually it got to the point where anti-Semitism was no longer socially acceptable, right? That doesn't mean that anti-Semitism doesn't still exist in America and it's not a problem, but it's not socially acceptable in the public realm. I would say the same is true for the Black community, right? That racism used to be very publicly acceptable against the Black community. And now, yes, is it still a problem? Absolutely. Is it still present? Yes. But the rhetoric that we're hearing is not the same as it was in the 1950s. And even more recently, I think that the LGBT community, the gay community, has seen very significant transformation in the way that they have been received in the public realm. And all of this gives me hope. It gives me optimism that if this work continues in interfaith spaces like this, that 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, our conversation is going to look very different. And we may not be able to eradicate Islamophobia in America, but we will be able to marginalize it significantly and not allow it to have the same sort of social acceptance and political clout that it holds now.
Thank you, Sarah, for that optimistic note. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you the pessimistic, the other side. That, but still, with an ending of optimism. I share your optimism. I think what Michelle, and one of the things that I agree with you wholeheartedly is that Michelle Bachmann is attacking Muslims because of the successful integration of Muslim Americans into civil society. We are engaging the government, they call that infiltration. We are in partnership with law enforcement like Deputy Chief Mike Downing, who is here, they call that infiltration. We're sending young Muslims to Washington to be a part of the political process. They call that infiltration. We are working with media to tell better stories about our community. They're calling that infiltration. We call it engagement. We are calling it winning for America. And if they are calling it infiltration, too bad. Tough luck to them. We are succeeding in the integration of Muslims in a Western society, and if we continue on that approach and succeeding, we will be the first Muslims in a Western society to be in a healthy, integrated form as part of a Western pluralistic society. And that will do a lot for not only America, but for the whole world. So that's the threat to their status quo. Good. I welcome that, because the status quo needs to be changed. Now the other side. It reminds me of Martin Luther King in that Birmingham jail, where he wrote the letter. He wrote the letter not criticizing racists. Racists are racist because that's their job, and if they're not racist, then somebody else will take their job for them. So we have racists. It's not going to go away. He wrote the letter criticizing the silence of white moderates. So the problem we're seeing today is not that there is xenophobia, is not that there is religious bigotry or racism. It is the silence of the political and religious leadership of America. That's the problem we are facing today. When we meet with our great interfaith partners here, one of the criticisms, and we don't like hearing it because we value our relationships, is that, oh, you're not dealing with the mainstream of the Jewish community. You're dealing with the fringe of the Jewish community. Or Christians, oh, they're not really representative of the Christian community. You have to deal with the more mainstream Christian community. Well, number one, we deal with whoever wants to work with us. Number two, that criticism against their own makes it very clear that they don't understand what it means to be a true member of a faith community working with others regardless of people's backgrounds, working for justice or mercy or compassion. So the silence of larger national groups in Washington, in the national religious landscape, is part of the problem. It is not just ignorance that is the issue. Everybody needs to be educated more. In fact, people have more than enough information about us today. The problem is when there is a willful exclusion or omission of who we really are, because it's just easier to make us look like the other. It's easier to paint all Muslims as the problem of our society today. It's easier to scapegoat, and therefore there is silence. Or even worse, there is legitimacy that is given to the Michelle Bachmans. There is a consideration for what she is saying, as if Muslims are a fifth column in America. This is very troubling for America. And we have to reframe the issue from being a problem for Muslims to being a problem for America. America has faced racism in the eye in the past. America has faced McCarthyism in the eye in the past. America has to face xenophobia in the eye today and speak loudly against it and say this is un-American and this is going to impede us from what America really is in order to achieve that greatness that this society is all about.
Could I just, I was going to say piggyback, but that would be a wrong term to use here.
We're fasting.
And you're fasting, exactly. Salam, you mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King writing from the Birmingham jail, and you're absolutely correct. He was challenging the religious leaders in Birmingham to join him in working for a greater society for everyone there. You know that that letter was never answered by those religious leaders. And that's where I'd like to chime in with what Rabbi Beliak here was saying. That letter was never responded to until 2 years ago, where some of us in a group called Christian Churches Together, where we're trying to bring Christians in some sort of unity, took that letter and responded to it. So we have to get our religious leaders on board here. All of our religious leaders, all of them.
Dr. Boozari?
I want to refer to one of what Salam said just recently in his interview with, I guess it was CNN, about Mitt Romney's reaction to Michelle Bachmann's statement. And Mitt Romney said, "Oh, okay, yes, I cannot require people to say what they want." Whereas Salam and Care and us here in Iman, we wanted a more straightforward, direct answer from Mitt Romney and his reaction, because we want to know what his ideas and theories and thoughts are about Muslims after he, I don't know, you never know him if he becomes the president. But about McCarthyism and one part of Dr. Namazikhah's question was, where are we heading? At the first question. When Seymour Martin Lipset, one of the most influential political scientists of the United States, wrote his dissertation in 1955, analyzing the rise of fascism and Nazism in Italy and Germany, he concluded, I mean, his dissertation later was published as a book called Political Man, much later in 1980. He concluded that, well, there are economic problems in every society. We are having a faltering economy. We are having a racial dynamic change in the United States. Maybe these are the reasons. But what are more important were that Lipset said not attending to social economic equality will amount to all forms of extremism. The very fact that I tried to raise in the first part, and that was the increase of the number of the hate groups that we are having in the United States now. And McCarthyism was the outproduct of not attending to social or economic equality, at the same time having some political players and people who wanted to gain more power in the Senate or influence the democratic process. Unfortunately, we have the same elements. I'm hoping that we don't get the same result, but we have the same elements in today's society, our country, in the United States, that if we don't attend to it, part of it can be made by religious groups, by disseminating religious thoughts and emotions and feelings and also teachings of religion to the whole population. But at the other hand, I think there is a much greater obligation on the shoulder of the government to take care of the needs of the society, especially those who are experiencing poverty, unemployment, and all the economic problems that we have in the society.
I want to issue a disclaimer that we talk about the Michelle Bachmann, Peter King. It's not talk about the Republican or Democratic Party. Without any question, it's not political, it's individual people that they are being questioned, and we are talking about their opinion, not the opinion of the parties. I'm sure that Brother Gilliland will talk about the Mitt Romney's opinion too.
You want me to talk about Mitt Romney?
No, I can't.
I'm a Democrat. I'm voting for Obama. And so many times we're sitting at a table of other people and they say, well, you're voting for Romney, of course. And I say no, and their jaws drop and they're surprised. But the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has Democrats and Republicans and independents and people of all faiths. And the church is neutral. The church leadership bends over backwards in trying to not in any way get involved politically. In fact, there are statements over the pulpit that are made in every congregation re-emphasizing that and saying there can be no politicking within any of our buildings. We will not rent any of our space or allow any of our space for political stuff, and also there's no literature to be passed out, political literature within our facilities. But everyone is encouraged to vote. Everyone is encouraged to study the issues and their politics. This raises another issue. People are surprised when they find out that I am a Democrat, because the stereotype is that all Mormons are Republicans. And I found a lot of stereotypes that in my experience, in my own self, in my experience with the Muslim people, we accepted our calling very frightened because this was 6 years ago. We were asked by the church to try to build some bridges into the Muslim community and build friends and organize some activities where Muslims and Mormons can get together and get to know each other, and which we've been working at over the years. But I've had people come up to me and say that they're fearful of my life, et cetera, and I've ended up just saying, you know, I feel safer in a mosque than I do in some right-wing Christian churches that I'm aware of. I feel safer with my brothers and sisters, or as safe with my brothers and sisters in Islam as I do with my Mormon, in my Mormon congregations. But I've had to shed a number of stereotypes that I had. When I first got involved with the Muslim people, I heard everybody saying, Inshallah, Inshallah. And I thought, that's a cop-out. God willing? Well, that's a cop-out. They're saying, well, if I don't get it done, then it's God's fault. It's not my fault. And the more I got to know the Muslim people, the more I realized that wasn't a cop-out. It was an expression of faith. When a Muslim says, Inshallah, it means all I do that is good is a blessing from God. And it's an expression of the importance of God in my life. In fact, you can't get through a Muslim conversation without hearing many references. Mashallah, Subhanallah. I'm mispronouncing some of this, I'm sure, but I hear it so many times.
That's because you're fasting.
Yeah, that's good. But I've realized how religious the Muslim people are. And I've had to change a lot of my misconceptions. And then, in turn, I'm sharing with my other brothers and sisters in the Latter-day Saint faith, and I get a lot of emails because they work with the Muslims, and they get an anti-Muslim email, and they send it over, what about this? And so I answer it back. And one person at a time, we're trying to change this. I get a little depressed in our discussion here because I feel so helpless. I realize that there are these different groups, and I realize that all this is going on, but what do I do as a human being, as an individual? And I think each of you probably feel the same. What can I do about all this? And I think the first step is to get to know people not of your faith. Sara emphasized the interfaith role in all of this. And do things like is happening today, and have panels and have people talk and listen to them. I think this is the beginning to turn some of this other stuff around. There's always going to be crazies. There are always going to be fringe people. But we need people like you and me to get to know our brothers and sisters of another faith and get to know they're human beings. And they're wonderful people. And I think that's a step in the right direction.
Islamophobia.
Islamophobia. I have a website called Jews on First. It's about the First Amendment and the responsibility of Jews to be involved with advocating for the First Amendment, separation of church and state. And so we've written 2 white papers on Islamophobia, one dealing with the movie called Obsession, which I'm ashamed to say has much of its origins and probably money coming from the Jewish community. This was the movie that was distributed during the last election cycle in millions of copies to suggest that Barack Obama was a Muslim and therefore not to be trusted, and so on and so forth. So the second white paper that we issued, and this is all interesting reading because we write so well and we're so clear and so forth. But the second one is actually about the controversy around the mosque that was going to be built, the community center that was going to be built near Ground Zero. And for that, we actually got some 30, 40 rabbis to give us their high holiday sermons, because I think more important is what are people saying in their congregations to their congregants about the issue of Islamophobia. So one of the things I would say is that Islamophobia is a knockoff. It's not an original kind of hate. It shares a great deal with another kind of hate called anti-Semitism. That's not to say that they're the same, but if you look at them structurally and you understand their history, they do share some important commonalities. In America, the notion of being fearful of Muslims and using that as a political platform to build your political career is a noble tradition now. Lots of American politicians have built their career around Islamophobia. In an earlier era, lots of politicians built their political careers around anti-Semitism. In Poland, where I said I work, In the 1920s and 30s, if you wanted to be a successful Polish politician, you were a good anti-Semite. And if I were to look at one thing that's going on in the political arena, can I say these names after the disclaimer? That the kings of the world and the Bachmans of the world are not isolated individuals. This society does not reject them. This society sends money to them. And so as long as you have Islamophobia as something that is accepted in the society and good people can build their political careers, you have a very great problem. And I think that has to be addressed from the pulpits and from the media and so on and so forth. Today in Poland, if you say anti-Semitic things, the public rejects you. It's not that there aren't anti-Semites in Poland. There are. But you can't build your political career on it. It's not a fuel for your political aspirations. The other thing I would say about Islamophobia is that it is fueled by a lot of fear, which is not to say something new, but this particular fear, especially in its manifestations of the fear of what's called the presence of Sharia law, which is a theme we haven't talked about yet. Previous panel we've talked about that, is a particularly interesting phenomena for me as a Jew, because clearly we have a parallel system in the halachic system that is, let's say, parallel to Sharia law. If we had more time, I would love to have a conversation about the historical parallels between these two. The suggestion that somehow Sharia law is about to overtake American civil law, of course, is an absurdity. But think about how in the last 2 years there have been all of these phony baloney resolutions and amendments in state constitutions in Oklahoma, and a large amount of energy, and here the manipulation of people's fears has allowed this to be a serious part of the political discourse. So I turn to that as another manifestation of Islamophobia. Because I've thought about this a lot, I do want to come back to a point that my colleague Rabbi Sara Bassin made. I do believe that the nature of Islamophobia in America is different than Islamophobia in Europe. They certainly share a great deal. And for instance, this Dutchman, Gert, does get to come to America and raise money for the Dutch campaign of hating Muslims in Holland. So yes, there is crossover and cross-fertilization. But one of the things I think that's unusual about America, and that's good, is that we have this forum and we have other forums where a small part of the Muslim population meets a small part of the Jewish population and the Mormon populations, etc. And we try to build some bridges. In this instance, I think one of the things that's also different about Europe is that people still live in ghettos, and these ghettos are not crossed very often. In America, because of universities, because of public schools, and because of mechanisms within our society, business being one of them, people do have to meet each other, they do have to have some contact. There is the issue of 5 o'clock shadow in American society, that is, after 5 o'clock people go home and they pursue their own lives and they return to their ethnic enclaves, but not as radically as we see in Europe. Thank you.
We live in a system that perpetuates violence. We live in a system that perpetuates economic disparity. We live in a system that perpetuates the easy accumulation of weapons. Anyone can acquire a weapon or any means to build a bomb. Just get on the internet, you can find it. We live in a system that perpetuates predatory capitalism. that perpetuates economic disparity, that perpetuates levels of despair and the ensuing radicalism of fringes of the society that have become disenfranchised or freaked out in some way, that results in this radical, extreme craziness. We have to change the system. We have to change the system that perpetuates this violence, that perpetuates this extreme economic disparity. We have to develop a new way, a new paradigm, that we live on this very planet. We're destroying the earth. We're in serious trouble here on this planet. And we need to look at the whole picture. We need to look at the whole picture, because out of that whole picture becomes this ability, these people who want to stigmatize, who want to demonize. They need to blame somebody out of the fear. They can't find the answer, so they have to strike out at something. And they reach inside themselves, and with their easy access to their guns, and then they do something crazy. This is what happens in this society. We've got to change this. And where does that change begin? Right here, right now, within each of us. I have the propensity within myself to demonize somebody, to be violent, to hate. But I also have the propensity within myself to reject that. I can stand in the integrity of my divine being. What does God want me to do? What am I being called in this lifetime to be? And if I stand in the integrity of the divine self, as Gandhi did, as Martin Luther King did, as all the sages and prophets and religious leaders throughout history have done and have taught us, then we are excommunicating all that radical stuff out of our beingness, and we are cultivating a culture of peace within ourselves. We are eradicating the violence within ourselves. I can be responsible for that. I can be responsible for changing myself. And then, within my sphere of influence, wherever I am, within whatever congregation I am in, right now, this is the congregation I'm in. Later on, I'll be with my family. That's my congregation. In my neighborhood, wherever I am, I can speak to that. I can sing to that. I can address that as best I can. And I know I'm not alone, because you're here. We're all here together. And any movement that has ever happened that has changed the paradigm happens because a group of people come together and perpetuate a new idea. And that idea eventually reaches a critical mass. And that critical mass creates the change. Women earned the right to vote because a critical mass was reached that allowed the suffrage movement to at last give women the right to vote in 1920. I grew up in the civil rights movement. And in that movement, we stood together to end American apartheid. That was a righteous cause. And because we reached a critical mass and we stood together and we walked together and we marched together and we activated together, we created the change. We need to create a change like that to end the stigmatism, to end this system that keeps perpetuating violence, that keeps perpetuating demonization of others, that keeps perpetuating hate. We need to root it out, beginning with ourselves and then joining together and having dialogues like this, where these ideas can be openly received, and where, once again, we can start to have a revolution of conscience, a revolution of consciousness that will change the paradigm so that this kind of stigmatization, this kind of enmity, this kind of perpetuation of violence and hatred against others ceases to exist.